So, who is Keir Starmer? Well, let's start at the beginning. How did he manage his meteoric rise to the top of the Crown Prosecution Service? Well, I think that can be neatly explained by this. Keith is truly law-brained. His forensic proceduralism boils down to writing, "The cops did nothing wrong," on any document within arm's reach until he's promoted to the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. More on some of these cases later. But I think you can see that's quite a plausible explanation. Keir, quite simply, his repeated refrain, "The cops did nothing wrong." Simply repeating that mantra seems to have been what has got him where he is. It's extremely difficult to imagine Keir Starmer mustering any sincere indignation at poverty, homelessness, racism, or any other fundamental social wrong. He is, rather, an unimaginative Securicat, an automaton whose ingrained instinct is to bloodlessly execute the orders programmed into him by his superiors, rather like Robocop, only without the occasional pangs of unease and the troubling flashbacks to his previous incarnation. Examination of Keir Starmer's career while he was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service certainly gives us an insight into the man himself, certainly in terms of how he's behaved since he became leader of the Labour Party and how he's likely to behave if and when he becomes Prime Minister. But despite his rather questionable time as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, he himself has attempted to mercilessly and shamelessly exploit this in service of his political career.
I don't know whether you know, but I worked as the Director of Public Prosecutions.
Goodness, what a shocker. Who knew that he was Director of Public Prosecutions and the head of the Crown Prosecution Service? It's just like when you find out his father was a toolmaker. It's just one of these things that he never mentions.
Toolmate, 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 toolmate.
But, as several commentators have pointed out, what Keir actually seems to be saying is Keir Starmer was responsible for all the good things at the CPS under him, but none of the bad things. Let's have a look at some of those bad things that all of a sudden Sir Keir isn't quite as keen to take responsibility for. Nowhere is the Starmer mantra of "the cops did nothing wrong" more clearly illustrated than in the De Menzi case.
Initial decision not to prosecute the killers of de Menezes is made by Ken MacDonald, Starmer's predecessor at the CPS, and he uncritically accepts the Met's narrative of what happened, which involves a huge number of distortions and actually at one point the destruction of physical evidence that implicated the officer who shot de Menezes. MacDonald makes this decision, but it subsequently goes to an inquest which uncovers the evidence that's destroyed and shows through previously unseen video footage that what the officers said about de Menezes. I think they had claimed that he had jumped the ticket barrier, that he was acting suspiciously, running away from them, being confrontational in other ways. And all of this whole narrative is completely demolished, both by the CCTV footage and also by eyewitness testimony. So in light of that, the inquest overturns the judgment of lawful killing that MacDonald made. And at that point, the case goes back to the CPS, who needed to make a final decision on the basis of this new evidence about whether to prosecute. And when the case arrives at Starmer's desk, he simply reaffirms the initial decision that had been made by his predecessor without considering the new details that have come to light, and the killers are never held responsible.
So, despite overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing by the police, Starmer decided to take no action. Why, you might wonder? Was it just his usual, the police did nothing wrong, or was there another motivation in this particular case? Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot dead at Stockwell Tube Station in South London on the 22nd of July 2005 after an officer mistook him for a suicide bomber in a counter-terrorism operation led by Dame Cressida, who was then Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And here he is, 16 years later, still defending her, just days before she resigned, in connection with the way that the Met handled the peaceful vigil that was being held in support of Sarah Everett. The woman that you might recall was actually raped and murdered by a serving Met officer.
Is Cressida Dick fit to continue? Would you want her out now too?
No, Cressida Dick is fit to continue. I've worked with Cressida over many years in relation to some very serious operations when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, and I was pleased that her contract was extended, and I support her.
The family of Jean-Charles de Menezes made their opinion of Cressida Dick crystal clear. There you have it. As far as Starmer's concerned, it's not just the cops who never do anything wrong and must be protected at all costs, it's their bosses who also never do anything wrong and must be protected at all costs.
This is the crowd at the G20 protest on April the 1st around 7:20 p.m. They are on Cornhill near the Bank of England. This footage will form the basis of a police investigation into the death of this man. Ian Tomlinson was walking through this area, attempting to get home from work. This is the final image of him alive. We've slowed down the footage to show how it poses serious questions about police conduct. Ian Tomlinson had his back to riot officers and dog handlers and was walking away from them. He had his hands in his pockets. Here the riot officer appears to strike Tomlinson's leg area with a baton. He then lunges at Tomlinson from behind. Tomlinson is propelled forward and hits the floor.
That looks like a pretty clear case of police misconduct. You would think no debate there then. Surely Keir Starmer's going to have to take action now in relation to this police officer. But you'd be surprised. Well, then again, you might not be surprised. In a written statement, the CPS admitted that there was sufficient evidence to bring a charge of assault against the officer, but claimed a host of technical reasons meant he could not be charged. This decision was as baffling to the Tomlinson family as it was to the rest of us. Paul King, Tomlinson's stepson, said shortly afterward, King said he, Starmer, has just admitted on TV that a copper assaulted our dad, but he hasn't done anything. He's the man in charge. Why hasn't he charged him? Well, Paul, technical reasons, don't you know? And what were some of these technical reasons? The Director of Public Prosecutions said that although there was sufficient evidence to bring a charge of common assault, the 6-month deadline for bringing such a prosecution had passed. And as his stepson accurately observed, they knew if they dragged this out long enough they would avoid charges. They knew just what they were doing. They've pulled us through a hedge backwards. Now we have to go on living our life. Tomlinson's stepson Paul King, flanked by his mother Julia, said, it's been a huge cover-up and they're incompetent. As in so many other cases, Starmer's record and the record of the organisation that he headed is actually nothing to be proud of, even down to making simple, basic mistakes in what was a high-profile case. CPS admits Ian Tomlinson report mistakes. CPS admits it made a mistake about locations involved in Ian Tomlinson's death during the announcement that no charges were being brought against the officer in the case. So there you have it. Starmer's mantra, the cops haven't done anything wrong. And now added to that as a codicil, Even when there's overwhelming evidence that they have done something wrong, I and my organisation, the CPS, will make sure they are never held accountable for it.
To strike Tomlinson's leg area with a baton. He then lunges at Tomlinson from behind. Tomlinson is propelled forward and hits the floor.
Let's have another look at Starmer's obsequious bootlicking behaviour, but this time not in relation to UK police force, but in relation to American officialdom, in particular Barack Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder. Eagleton describes how, on the international scene, Starmer worked with foreign judicial institutions on issues like terrorism and migration offences, and developed an especially close relationship with his opposite number in the US, Barack Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder. Whenever the US sought to extradite a British citizen, Starmer was eager to oblige. The most notorious case was that of Gary McKinnon, a young autistic UFO enthusiast who managed to hack into a US military database he thought might store information on that topic. Eagleton picks up the story.
IT expert who was very interested in UFOs and did a lot of kind of independent research on them and wanted to access US military databases to find information on UFOs, which he wasn't interested in publishing or sharing with anyone, but simply to satisfy his own curiosity. So he gained access to these systems by exploiting their remarkably weak, security codes. I think he guessed that the password to one of them would not be changed from the default password, and managed to gain access as a result. And to prove that they were kind of shaping up and, beefing up their national security, they decided to doggedly pursue him with an extradition order. So Starmer inherited this case, and one of the people high up in the CPS who I spoke to said that he had direct conversations with Holder's team about Gary McKinnon's extradition, and that he pledged to do everything in his power to seal it and ensure it. There's a very telling episode in the memoir of Gary McKinnon's mother, Janice Sharp, where she confronts Starmer about this and says, how can you have no sympathy for my son, who is becoming increasingly suicidal as his appeals are being thrown out, and he's being, pursued through the courts on his way to potentially spend 70 years in an American military jail. And Starmer says, you're making me very uncomfortable by saying these things to me.
And guess who saved the day to actually intervene and protect this young man from Starmer's vindictive harassment? McKinnon was on the point of being extradited to a 70-year jail sentence in the US when Theresa May, the then Conservative Home Secretary, intervened to halt the process on the grounds that the move would be, quote, incompatible with Mr. McKinnon's human rights. Yes, possibly the coldest, most distant, emotionally cauterised person in UK politics actually demonstrated she had more empathy and more respect for human rights than Keir Starmer, the erstwhile human rights lawyer. And as for Lickspickle Starmer, well, how did he respond? Enraged and humiliated, Starmer immediately flew to Washington to apologise in person to Holder. But one thing's for sure, Gary seems to have had more success in tracking down evidence of UFOs than many Labour Party members and many Labour Party voters have had in finding a backbone or any trace of integrity in their current party leader. And now on to the case of Julian Assange. This case is particularly sickening because, again, Keir Starmer constantly promotes himself as a human rights lawyer. But anybody who looks at the Julian Assange case can clearly see that human rights for Julian Assange have been totally trashed, and a main player in that trashing has been Keir Starmer. He actually released to the world evidence of human rights abuses by the US military. But instead of that being Keir Starmer's main focus of concern, his main focus of concern has been the person that told the truth about the abuses, not the abuses themselves. Prosecutors allege that Assange unlawfully helped former US Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning to steal thousands of classified diplomatic cables and military files, which were published by WikiLeaks in 2010. Assange founded the whistleblowing site in 2006. The documents in question related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and revealed that the US had killed hundreds of civilians in Afghanistan in previously undisclosed incidents. The leaked files also showed that 66,000 civilians had been killed by Iraqi forces and that prisoners had been tortured. As always, when something has Starmer's fingerprints on it. During Starmer's time in post, the CPS was marked by irregularities surrounding the case of the WikiLeaks founder, and recent revelations by Declassified UK have unearthed even more worrying accusations against Starmer and his behaviour while he was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. CPS has destroyed all records of Keir Starmer's visits to Washington when he was in charge of Julian Assange's proposed extradition. Isn't that a bit odd?
You guys remember Julian Assange, right? He's the WikiLeaks founder who published juicy US intel and is basically living a life of hell behind bars in the UK for it. Well, Declassified has found that around the time he was facing extradition to Sweden, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, was meeting with authorities in Washington. We're talking 2009 to 2013. What's really odd is that when Starmer left his position at the Crown Prosecution Service, all the records from those trips were destroyed. Starmer was in charge of Assange's proposed extradition to Sweden. And what is definitely not a coincidence is that on those trips to Washington, UK officials who are involved in areas like extradition, national security, and counterterrorism were traveling with him. Also, CPS admits to destroying critical emails related to Assange. All this while he faces extradition to the US, where he could spend life behind bars. The question remains, what did the records of Starmer's trips to Washington contain?
So, whether your human rights are being abused by a foreign occupying power, or you're a UK national and your human rights and civil liberties are being abused by the UK police force, you can always be sure that Keir Starmer's priority is and always will be to protect the powerful at the expense of the most vulnerable. Andrew Malcolmson is just the latest in a series of questions being asked about Sir Keir Starmer and his management of the Crown Prosecution Service. Malcolmson, 57, was convicted in 2004 of a rape in Greater Manchester despite there being no DNA evidence. Having spent almost 2 decades trying to convince the authorities he was innocent, the Court of Appeal overturned his conviction last month after fresh DNA testing linked another man to the crime. No prizes for guessing who was the head of the CPS when this new evidence, this fresh DNA evidence that actually exonerated the man in prison for it came to light. That man was Keir Starmer. He had both a legal and a moral obligation to make sure that that miscarriage of justice was corrected as quickly and as swiftly as possible. Questions regarding Sir Keir's role as DPP and head of the Crown Prosecution Service (CPS) after it emerged that DNA evidence which exonerated Mr Malcolmson came to light in 2007 and was known to all the key agencies including the CPS in 2009. Sir Keir was DPP from 2008 to 2013. And what does Sir Keir Starmer have to say for himself in relation to these questions? Well, considering his previous statements, you would have thought it would have been self-evident what he would be saying to it. But Labour Shadow Justice Minister Ellie Reeves is doing the TV rounds today, letting everyone know how Labour will be tougher on crime than the Tories. When asked if she's talked to Keir Starmer about the Andrew Mogson miscarriage of justice case, Reeves says, quote, Keir has been clear that it wasn't something that ever came across his desk.
Well, Keir Starmer's been clear that this wasn't something that came across his desk when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. And
that was a lie then when he said that he took full responsibility for all decisions in all the cases that were handled by the Crown Prosecution Service while he was the Director of Public Prosecutions, i.e. the man in charge of that organisation.
As DPP, I head up the Crown Prosecution Service, and essentially that means I take the lead on all legal issues and carry ultimate responsibility for our policy and ultimate responsibility for all of the decisions that are made in all the hundreds of thousands of cases day in, day out by the CPS.
And more recently, the Labour leader told Sky News in April that he took, quote, full responsibility for every decision of the Crown Prosecution Service when I was Director of Public Prosecutions. Actually, it turns out he's only prepared to take responsibility for those cases that, quote, came across his desk. Well, that's a very significantly smaller number. So Keir Starmer said questions about his role as Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, during the wrongful conviction of Andrew Mogson should be, quote, directed elsewhere. But wouldn't questions about his behaviour when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, i.e. head of the Crown Prosecution Service, wouldn't they be better directed to him than anybody else? Who else can tell us more than he can about his own behaviour? Could it possibly be the guy who said this?
And I will carry the can for mistakes of any organisation that I lead.
Is actually going to blame his subordinates? Questions should be asked elsewhere. The reality is, any examination of Keir Starmer's role as Director of Public Prosecution and his time in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service clearly shows him to be interested in nothing more than kowtowing to the powerful and protecting the powerful. And that pattern, that template, that is what we have seen in terms of his leadership of the Labour Party. And believe me, that is what we'll see if and when that man becomes Prime Minister. As Matt Zard Cousins puts it, this is the problem with constantly prattling on about having been Director of Public Prosecutions, as if people actually care. You just open yourself up to completely legitimate scrutiny of your tenure. This is the tip of a massive iceberg too. His record is a complete bin fire.
I don't know whether you know, but I worked as the Director of Public Prosecutions.